Hi everybody, it's 314 Reactor here. Today we're going to be looking at Quake 2 RTX 1.4 and I'm going to be playing it on my RTX 3090. We're just going to look over some of the new features. So now they've made the Vulkan Ray Tracing API final, and it now can support any GPU that supports the ray tracing pipeline. So that means this can now run on new AMD hardware, I think. So that's pretty cool. It's added some temporal upscaling, which I'm going to have a little look at, because even on the 3090, this still runs relatively slow because it's a full path trace solution. So it's quite difficult to run. So we're going to see if there's any performance improvements. There's a few fixed issues here, nothing too big. Some denoiser improvements, makes the image more stable in reflections and refractions. Implement some improved sampling, a lot of stuff around glass, reflections, refractions, etc. Improve the temporal filter to make light more stable on high detail surfaces. I have noticed there's some weird parts in Quake 2 RTX where, yeah, the light can sometimes catch up. You can see the rays like filling in or lagging behind, so I wonder if some of these fixes will fix that. We'll have to see. That should be interesting. And then there's a few miscellaneous improvements here. Reduce the amount of stutter that happen when new geometry is loaded. Some adjustments to stack resolution scale. Cool. So it's not a massive update. Still no DLSS added, which is odd. I'd have thought they'd have added that in, because DLSS 2 could really keep the image quality high of Quake 2 RTX, but also boost the frame rate considerably. But they haven't done that yet. I'm not sure why. Hopefully they will. Anyway, that's just a quick overview of the patch. Let's dive in and take a look. Okie dokie. First thing to note, I've just tried booting it up. It's giving me a fatal error. It needs NVIDIA graphics drivers to be at least 46082, whereas my current is 46079. I thought mine were up to date, but obviously I didn't check before loading up. So you've got to make sure that your NVIDIA graphics driver is up to date, and probably AMD driver as well. So it's off to GeForce Experience, getting that installed. So once that's installed, I'll try booting up the game again, and then we'll take a look. So yeah, need to make sure graphics drivers are up to date. Alrighty, so here we are. In the main menu, let's go to video. So the first thing I see is that there's a new anti-aliasing method, as noted in the release notes. Temporal upscaling. Gonna give that a go later. I'll leave that temporal AA now, and then we'll try that out later. There's also ray tracing API. Prefer Vulkan standard or prefer NVIDIA extensions. Again, I'm gonna see what the performance is like on that, and then under scaling options, the minimum scale can now go down to 25. Again, as noted in the release notes, but we're going to see just how some of these settings affect the look and the frame rate. So we load in a game, load in from the outer base. Okay, so I've got the frame rate in the top right there. It might be a bit difficult to see unless you're running full screen, but it's at 36 frames a second. So I'm running this at 4K with a Core i7 6700K and 30 gigs of RAM, and of course the 3090. Oh. There's a glitch there where I think because I've got a shotgun in like another save or something, it seems to show the pistol as a shotgun until I switch back to it. So that's what's happening there. So this looks really good. It's running fairly good for what's happening here. Again, this is fully ray traced, so it's going to be tough to run, especially at 4K. So that's why we're getting 30 to 40 frames a second. What will be interesting to see is if we go to an outside area like here, 36 frames, and if we go to video, we should be able to change to temporal upscaling. So I think from my understanding, where you're rendering a lower resolution frame and then using data from other frames to fill in the gaps, get a higher resolution frame. I think Breakpoint has the same thing, and it works fairly nicely. It gives a nice FPS boost, but it does introduce some visual artifacting, especially with smaller sort of things like grass and hair. Let's go back to the game. And frame rate looks about the same. And the visuals also look very similar. So that's with AA totally off. And that gives us same frame rate again. So yeah, I imagine what's happening here is that whatever does the anti-aliasing on the GPU is running parallel to whatever's doing the ray tracing. And because the ray tracing is so hard to do, that's the bottleneck factor. So actually changing the anti-aliasing doesn't make any difference. Even turning anti-aliasing off makes no difference to the frame rate. So I think the only thing to see is what the visual difference is. I've just been looking for a few minutes, and it seems that temporal upscaling looks pretty good. There might be some loss of detail in more distant textures, or textures overall, but it does tend to smooth out jagged edges just a little bit more than temporal AA. Like, I was looking at the front of the gun there, and with temporal AA on, you might not even see this on YouTube because of YouTube's compression, and if you're not watching it in 4K, but I can kind of see there's sort of more jagged edges that are noticeable when I have to get really close to my screen though. Especially on that building at the top there and at the very front of the gun itself. But when I go to temporal upscaling, those edges just seem a little bit smoother. The reason why they're smoother could be because of additional blur from the temporal upscale. So like I say, I think it probably smooths out edges a bit more, but probably reduces detail in textures, especially far away. So that's a bit of a tricky one. But yeah, it doesn't appear to make any difference to the frame rate whatsoever. Like I said, the work that's being done on the ray tracing is the bottleneck there, and anything you do with anti-aliasing is not going to change that, at least not on a 3090. Or there could be some other limiting factor, even CPU. Just checking out, my CPU is at like 1% here, and the GPU is at 100%, so yeah, I don't think it's CPU in this case. So, the other thing which may make a difference is switching the preferred API. So again, let's get an FPS check, 35 frames there, and let's switch to prefer NVIDIA extensions. Frame rate, basically the same, 35. So again, I don't think that makes too much difference either. Yeah, I think that literally just switches it between using the APIs for NVIDIA's direct thing or the Vulkan APIs that can work with AMD or any other ray tracing compatible hardware. That's pretty interesting stuff. You know, I'm not the expert on this. I imagine someone like Digital Foundry probably has a better video somewhere that'll explain this stuff in more detail. But in general, at least for me, the anti-aliasing doesn't make too much of a difference to the frame rate. And neither does switching the API extensions that are preferred. The overall game does feel a bit smoother than it last did when I was running on my 3090. See, I think they've added in some performance enhancements. The general look of the lighting looks a bit more solid. I'm seeing less lag and noise issues. Like some of these darker areas, I remember noticing sort of noise. And I'm getting less of that. Still a bit there on that reflection there. So that's interesting. I do wonder maybe if that's to do with the temporal upscaling. Let's go back to temporal AA. No, not related. In fact, resolution scaling options. Let's turn fixed resolution scale to 25%. Wow. Now that's really blurry. But it is running at 98 frames a second. It's maybe where we can see the effects of the temporal upscaling more. Oh, wow. So yeah, actually, this actually gives us the ability to see more of what that anti-aliasing is doing. So you can see here, it looks a little bit sharper, but you can see there's more jagged edges. And then when you go to temporal upscaling, the jagged edges are a lot smoother, but I think there's a loss of detail on the distant textures. So that actually gives us a pretty good view of what that's doing. In fact, there's not actually that much loss of detail in textures, and it does smooth things out. So I think in terms of overall anti-aliasing, the temporal upscale seems to be a better solution, at least for now. It doesn't appear to have any weird visual artifacting. Let's try and find an area where there's some glass to really look at. Here we go. So I don't remember really seeing many issues with the glass refractions before. Let's make sure that thick glass is on. Denoiser, yes, thick glass refraction enabled. I think that might look a little bit better. Could be placebo effect. You still see some like denoising sort of issues there, or like where the rays are catching up. You can see there's a slight blur as you move across. But overall, that looks really nice. And you can see you've got the reflection of the character from what's behind, but also the distorted view of what's the other side of the glass. So you've got like the reflection and the refraction coming through from the other side at the same time. That's really, really cool effect. I do really love ray tracing. And look at that. It's really thick glass, and you've got that refraction coming up through it. I love those kind of things in ray tracing that you can't really do in raster without a great deal of hacking and messing about, and then getting like a subpar effect at the end of it. This is like full on rays refracting, passing through, reflecting properly, and giving a really realistic sort of effect. And as I move the time of day around, you can kind of see where the light still kind of fills in with the rays, and you can see the denoiser kicking in as well, I think. overall it looks so gorgeous. Just the full dynamic movement of the sun, the shadows, everything that's happening there. Let's move on to another level and we'll play around with the sky and the time of day a bit more. So here we are at the mine intro. This gives us a good little sky to deal with. First thing I want to do is take this moment to just show a nice area with the temporal upscaling on, and then I'll switch it off so you can get a direct comparison. So this is with the temporal upscaling on. This is with temporal AA on. And this is with no anti-aliasing at all. Now again, we can get a better view of what this is doing by cranking down the fixed scaling. So that way I can continue recording in 4K, but we're getting very low resolution scaled through. So this with no anti-aliasing, you can see this just makes it clearer on what the anti-aliasing is doing. So this is with no anti-aliasing. This is with temporal AA. You can see it smoothed out some of those jaggies. And then that's with temporal upscaling. So to me, the temporal upscaling looks better. It's not losing too much detail in textures. We're back at 4K and it's less noticeable there, but it still does look just a little bit smoother. And I haven't seen any negative effects of that yet, so I'm just going to leave temporal upscaling on. Now, I've had blue sky here for a long time because it just demonstrates very nicely the sort of time of days as you move the sun around in the sky. So you can switch from day to night. And I think this is where the ray tracing really kicks in, because as you can see, you've got like the differing levels of exposure there, with that little green thing on the floor there next to that body, and the lava as well. And as like it's not producing that much light in comparison to the sun, but as shadow goes over it, it produces a bit more green glowing light. And as it gets darker, you can see the glow from the lava really kicking in, really pushing that shadowing. And the glow from that little pickup is just even more. The lights there, the shadowing, the whole scene changes really dynamically, really nicely. And there's no sort of issues with raster that you'd get or weird things going on with ambient occlusion or the shadows. It's all pretty much running flawlessly, real time, really nice, really beautiful. So you can capture pretty much anything from late night to early morning there, and the ray tracer will just handle it. And all that shadowing, you can see a little bit of like ambient occlusion in the corner there because of the lava light comes up. It's kind of giving a little bit of shadowing in that little bit. Of course, when the sun's up, that's not really there, and as soon as the sun's directly hitting it, it's not really there. Really beautiful. Another thing that would really help is by giving this game 10-bit HDR. That would really make colors pop even more and make the lighting have even more depth to it, which would look really beautiful. So that's hopefully something else they do along with DLSS. So let's change the sky type to Strobos. And here we see more of what the game is supposed to look like. And again, you can still move that sun around in the sky. It's just very much an alien planet now. The night looks very similar because obviously it's a lack of light. But then you go around. Again, just really nice. All the ambient occlusion, global illumination, shadowing, reflections, refractions, everything is all being handled by the ray tracer, and it all just works together really seamlessly. And again, we've got 35 frames a second out here. It seems to be generally that it's about 35 frames a second in outside areas and around 44, 45 frames a second in inside areas. That's what I've seen so far. And I think the performance, like I say, is a little bit better than when I last fired it up on the 3090. Could just be placebo though. Another thing they noted was a few improvements to the static rendering, which is where you can pause the game and it will render a really, really highly sampled, super duper ray trace scene that's too detailed to do in real time, but you can do it with by pressing the pause key. So I think some like depth of field is kicking in there. As you can see, it takes quite a few seconds just to render that up. So in future, this is the kind of detail that we could expect in games when they're fully path traced. Barely any aliasing there as well. So I think it's also rendering at a higher internal resolution. That floor looks a bit weird though. That never seems to fill in. There's still like little white spots on it or grey spots on it. I'm not sure what's going on there. Photo mode settings. Number of frames to accumulate 500. See, it's accumulating a huge number of frames worth of rays. So I think the way it works at the moment is per frame. To keep it performant, it sends out a certain number of rays, takes them back, then the denoiser handles getting rid of the artifacts from so few rays. So yeah, you can turn off the denoiser by pressing F8. So that's the sort of limited number of rays that are being sent out right now. You can see the data that it's getting back is not enough to provide a solid image, so the denoiser uses, I think, an AI algorithm to take those samples and make it into a nice smooth image. But when you go into photo mode, it takes like many frames worth of those rays going out and accumulates them to make a really high-res image. So I've turned the accumulation up to 8,000 there. So it should be 8,000 frames worth of rays flying out and coming back. Field, let's turn depth of field off because that was a little bit too strong. Camera aperture shaped circle, not entirely sure how that changes things. I'll leave that at the moment. Alrighty, let's do this. Okay, so as you can see, it's accumulating samples, but by the time it hit about 10-15%, it's pretty much a completed image. So I think anything more, I think you start to get diminishing returns. But we're going to let it render anyway, and we're going to see what it looks like when it's done. I imagine it's because by the time you've done a certain amount of rays and accumulated them, you've already got enough data to fill in few million pixels that are needed for 4K. So I imagine that's the limiting factor here. But if you were to get this running real time and have like that many rays flying out in like 16.6 milliseconds or less, and you had a higher resolution screen, you would probably see improvements there. And you'd probably also see, with more rays flying out faster, you'd see less of the lag as you go around corners and see that ray, like the rays filling in, you see less of that. So there we go, that's the finished render, and that looks pretty smooth. Here we go, so the free camera. Can't move the mouse around, but I can move it back and forward. So you can see what I mean. This is great for showing off the sort of lag of rays that we see when going around corners and stuff, without that denoiser activated and with so many rays flying out, because it has to, as you move, it has to catch up on what parts of the scene have to be traced. But yeah, you can definitely see as soon as it hits 15%, you get diminishing returns. You can really see it kicking in just under that little bit here, as we get closer where the bricks are. You can see as the rays fill in, that you can just see it just gets a little bit more detailed. The shadowing just becomes a little bit more defined. That's so interesting to see. It's really fascinating how that stuff works, and I'm really excited to see where ray tracing is going to be in a decade or so. See, there's an issue of what I mean. Just as we come around the corner, you can see it's almost like the ray tracer has to catch up by filling out those areas. So that's an optimization which is really obvious at the nighttime, but I think it's probably a necessary evil just to keep this performant at the moment. But it still looks really beautiful. Like, just the shadowing there is just so amazing. Because not only is it adding shadowing as the rocket comes out and it as it moves around, the shadowing moves around. It's also, because there's extra light coming in there, it's getting rid of that shadow there, but then adding shadow through there and getting rid of that sort of ambient occlusion, just giving a direct shadow as it comes around. The only issue there is that where the shadow disappears, you can see the rays filling back in. So let's render this scene again with 8,000 frames. You can see at nighttime, by the time it's hit 15%, there's still details that need filling in. There's still noise. So I'll see if there's less light, there's less samples. So you need more samples over time to fill in those gaps. Same for the shadows as well. You can slowly see that bit on the left is kind of filling in a bit more as it gets more data about that darkened area. I do wonder if that'll fully fill in when it hits 100%. There we are with the finished product. There's still a bit of noise in that left part there with the shadowing. So I think there are diminishing returns, but those extra frames certainly help. That diminishing return point in the darker areas seems to be much higher than the lighter areas. So it seemed to hit about 30-40% before we started getting diminishing returns. Again, you can still see this noise here in the darker areas. If you were to have a high enough res screen where you just couldn't see pixels at all, even with your face up to it, and to have that level of ray tracing, and then have a more modern game as well applied to it, you would have basically photorealistic graphics, and that would just look incredible. So hopefully that's where we'll be in a few years, because this is still the early phases of ray tracing. I would love to see how this runs and looks on an AMD card. Hopefully AMD can come up with a really good solution that can challenge NVIDIA and Intel as well, and then we can really push forward and move this tech in the right direction, because ray tracing is definitely the future. That was Quake 2. Version 1.4 new release came out a couple of days ago. Make sure you get your drivers updated. I think if you don't own Quake 2, you can play the shareware levels for free with RTX. But if you own Quake 2, you can just download Quake 2 RTX and get all the levels. Highly recommend it. Please do let me know if you have an AMD card and what performance you're getting. I think the new AMD cards that support ray tracing are out now. So yeah, do drop a comment if you have one. Do drop a like and a subscribe. Hit the little bell, really helps. Keep an eye out for future videos on tech and video games. And I will see you in the next one.